Hey, welcome to SurgiSmart. We're kicking off a brand new 4-part series all about gastric polyps. And in this first explainer, we are going right back to the basics. We're going to cover how common they are, that's the epidemiology, and just as importantly, where they come from, which is the etiology. Okay, let's jump right in.
So picture this. You're going in for a totally routine upper endoscopy. Maybe for something common like acid reflux. The procedure itself is no big deal, but afterward your doctor says, hey, we found something we weren't expecting. It's what's called an incidental finding, and it needs a closer look.
So what exactly is this surprise? Well, more often than not, it's something called a gastric polyp. But what does that even mean? Let's break it down. In the simplest terms, a gastric polyp is just a small growth of tissue that kind of sticks out from the inner lining of your stomach. You can think of them as little bumps or mounds on what should be a smooth surface. And here's the thing. Most of the time, they are completely asymptomatic. You would probably never, ever know you had one without that endoscopy. So just how common is this? Well, get this. These polypoid lesions pop up in about 6% of all upper endoscopies. To put that in perspective, that means for about every 17 procedures, a doctor finds a polyp. So while it might feel like a surprise to you, for gastroenterologists, it's a pretty familiar sight.
Okay, so here's where it gets interesting. Gastric polyps is really just a big umbrella term. Not all polyps are created equal. And while there are a bunch of different kinds, we're going to focus on the 3 main types that make up the vast majority of cases. If you understand these 3, you've got the essential picture. And this chart really lays it all out. Look at that! Fundic gland polyps are by far the most common. We're talking up to 77% of all cases. Next up, you've got hyperplastic polyps. And then way down at the bottom, you see adenomatous polyps. They are incredibly rare, making up less than 1% of all the polyps that are found.
Now, knowing the type of polyp is absolutely crucial. Why? Because it gives doctors a massive clue as to why it even formed in the first place. So let's dig into the root causes, because this is where the story really starts to come together.
Let's start with the big one, Fundic gland polyps. These are usually small, smooth, and found in the upper part of the stomach. But here is the real kicker. There's a super strong link between these polyps and a class of medication that millions of people take every single day, proton pump inhibitors, or PPIs for acid reflux. It just goes to show, as medicine evolves, we see these new patterns emerge.
And when I say a strong link, I mean it. A major study actually put a number on it. They found that long-term PPI use over a decade leads to a relative risk increase of 17. That is a huge, statistically significant connection between a very common medication and these specific polyps. Okay, next up, hyperplastic polyps. Now these aren't caused by a medication. They're actually the body's reaction to long-term irritation or inflammation, what doctors call gastritis, which is often caused by an H. pylori infection. Think of it like this. The body is trying to heal the damaged stomach lining, but it just gets a little overenthusiastic. The good news, the cancer risk is really low, though it does start to creep up if the polyp gets bigger. And that brings us to our third and rarest type, Adenomatous polyps. Even though they're less than 1% of the total, these are the ones that really demand our attention. And the reason is simple. These are considered precancerous. They aren't cancer yet, but they're on a direct path to becoming it. So how does that transformation happen? Well, it follows a pretty well-known path. It all starts with chronic inflammation, the very same trigger that can cause the more harmless hyperplastic polyps. But in this case, the constant irritation makes the stomach cells change into cells that look more like they belong in the intestine. That's called metaplasia. Then, over time, those changed cells can become disorganized and abnormal, and that's dysplasia. That dysplasia is the hallmark of an adenomatous polyp, and it's the very last step before it can turn into a full-blown stomach cancer. Whew. Okay, we've covered the 3 main players and their very different backstories, from a reaction to medication, to the body's own healing process, to a dangerous cellular change. So let's pull all these threads together.
All right, if you remember one thing from today, make it this slide. This is really the big takeaway. On one hand, you have Fundic gland polyps, mostly tied to PPI use, with almost zero cancer risk. Then you have the 2 types that are driven by inflammation. The hyperplastic ones, which are a low-risk, overhealing response, and the adenomatous ones, which represent a high-risk, precancerous change. This table just lays out those critical differences perfectly.
So, we figured out the what and the why of gastric polyps. We get that there are different kinds with totally different stories, but that leaves a couple of huge questions hanging in the air, right?
Like, when a doctor actually sees a polyp, how on earth can they tell a harmless one from a high-risk one? And what does that mean for you? Well, that's exactly what we're going to cover, diagnosis and management, in Part 2. I'll see you there.